with the views that we've seen here of Cruden Bay, the beach, the golf course, the rocks with the nesting seabirds, the castle, you know, there is an awful lot that's much more important to Cruden Bay than an oil pipeline. But I don't want to leave here without emphasising the importance of that pipeline to the UK economy. That pipeline is the most important pipeline bringing oil from the North Sea to shore. It brings about 40% of North Sea oil to shore. Now, it's connected to over 80 different fields now. It's a hub line, and no other pipeline brings that much oil to shore. About 25% of the oil coming to shore actually comes from offshore loading tankers. And when the Forties pipeline was laid, it was one of the first to use a pipeline, and in fact the first to bring oil to shore. Most of the other fields that were developed, 5 of the first 6 fields developed, used tanker loading offshore. And in fact, the Amoco Montrose development, which came online in 1976, used 2 tankers that were owned by the Canadian Pacific Railroad Company. And in honour of Lord Strathcona, who was one of the prime movers behind that railway line, they named their tanker the Lord Strathcona, which was kind of interesting given that he subsequently became the first chairman of Anglo-Persian, or BP as it became known, later on. Now, the other thing that I should mention about the lines coming into Cruden Bay is that actually the original line, the original 32-inch line, which was about as big as they could handle back in 1973, the original line was replaced in the 90s by a larger 36-inch line. They started to detect a little bit of corrosion, and they also needed the higher capacity. So in the 90s we had a second line laid to shore and through the beach dunes and following the same route up to the pumping station. And if that wasn't enough, in the late 90s there's another line that people will not be familiar with probably, and that's a fibre optic line. And that fibre optic line that runs from Aberdeen through Cruden Bay out to the Forties field and then across to the Ula field in Norway, down to Everest field in the UK sector, is now connected through TampNet to a whole North Sea network of fibre optic data connections, which has transformed the way fields are operated, the way they're monitored, the way that production is optimized. And that's another significant line that comes in through Cruden Bay. So here we are at the end of our journey from Slains Castle down through Cruden Bay, and we're at the Forties pipeline system pumping station at Cruden Bay. But of course, actually it's quite a distance south of Cruden Bay and out of sight at this point from Cruden Bay itself. And the line that we've followed up over the beach at Cruden Bay comes down the road here and into the pumping station behind me. And one thing we haven't mentioned is that actually when St Fergus gas terminal was built a few years later, there was a line constructed to take natural gas liquids from the gases, the natural gases coming into St Fergus, take those liquids components down to the pumping station here, where they join the main offshore oil line and then continue their journey down south, all the way 105 miles down to Kinneil on the south banks of the Firth of Forth, with the Grangemouth refinery on one side and actually the location of an old coal mine on the other side. So we see the energy transition coming in there again, the coal mines that have vanished and the oil facilities that have replaced them. And at Kinneil is a much bigger facility than this pumping station. Here, basically all that's happening is they're boosting the pressure of the oil to keep it moving on its journey south. But at Kinneil, there's some proper process engineering going on, and the liquids, the natural gas liquids, are extracted from the mixed stream, and these are then either exported in bulk from Grangemouth docks or passed across to the petrochemical works that's part of the refinery complex. The stabilised crude oil itself moves from Kinneil to tank farms at Dalmeny, and from Dalmeny the oil is then pumped to a marine tanker loading terminal at Hound Point. And if you're travelling by train from Aberdeen down to Edinburgh and you cross the Forth Railway Bridge, you'll clearly see Hound Point out to the east, and then as the rail line curves round, you'll see the Dalmeny tank farm just south of the railway line. The interesting thing is that the location of the Dalmeny tank farm is actually what 100 years ago was the location of a shale mine and shale oil refinery that became part of Scottish Oils Limited, and was then taken over, became a subsidiary of Anglo-Persian, and a mere 50 years before the arrival of North Sea oil, that operation came to an end, and the shale bing that was left, the waste component of the rock that was mined, the shale bing that was left, was hollowed out to provide earthworks that protected the surroundings from any possible spillage of oil from the tanks that store the North Sea oil. So there we again have the connection between the past and the present. Now the thing about this actually relatively modest facility, at the moment it's undergoing a renovation and an expansion to make it more fit for purpose for the current needs, but actually it's a relatively small presence compared with St Fergus or compared with Kinneil and Grangemouth. There are some farm buildings that are similar size to this particular pumping station. But despite its relatively modest presence, there is a lot of oil passes through. Oil production reached its peak probably around 1978, around 500,000 barrels of oil per day. Now, part of the story of North Sea oil is how the price changes. When BP made an investment decision, and when the land for the pipeline pumping station was sold, oil was selling for about $3 a barrel. Conveniently, in '73, when the line was actually being laid across the beach at Cruden Bay, there was one of those Arab-Israeli wars, the Yom Kippur War, and oil prices tripled overnight when those countries that supported Israel defending itself against Arab attacks found that the Arabs were trying to intimidate them by boycotting them and oil sales to them. So that was kind of good, because that protected BP against the risks that it was taking and the difficulties it was facing in developing the fields. And then come 1978, when the oil was at its flowing at its peak from the Forties field, we had the Iranian Revolution, and prices jumped yet again. So when you look at it, 500,000 barrels a day, let's call it $40 a barrel in 1978, we're looking at $20 million a day of value passing through this little pumping station. And of course, that is not profit to the oil companies. A large part of it goes in taxation payments, and then you've got the enormous costs of working in a hostile environment, drilling out there and 500 feet of water or whatever in the storms that we see in the North Sea, etc. So, and sometimes the oil companies during a recession, financial crisis 2008, oil demand drops, oil price drops like any other commodity, whether it's bananas or beef from cattle, and then they can be making a loss for a while, for a period, until the prices pick up again. Now the funny thing is that when Jill and I were doing an initial trial of this story, I was watching as Jill's jaw dropped when I mentioned $20 million a day, and I thought that was kind of interesting, so I got talking with her, and to my amazement, it turned out that Jill's father farmed Ogston Farm and sold the land to BP for the building of the pumping station. So that was quite an amazing connection. And at the time, actually, I think it was a couple of years back, I had also been to the Aberdeen Arts Centre, where they had been staging a revival of the famous John McGrath play, The Cheviot, The Stag and the Black Oil, which is a remarkable piece of political theatre come Cayley. And it was first toured Scotland, small village halls round the north, in 1973. It started out at the Aberdeen Arts Centre in 1973, while the pipeline was being laid across the beach in Cruden Bay. And it really was a very political piece of theatre, but its premise was that the poor local people of the land were being ripped off by greedy capitalists all through history, from the moving of crofters to make room for sheep, for hunting deer, and for building new pipeline terminals. Some good points, but I think you've seen today that there has been, after almost 50 years, no impact on Cruden Bay, and the farming is still going on here, and I think Jill's dad was quite happy to do the transaction and sell the land. And obviously BP had to do an amazing job negotiating with everybody else along the length of that 105-mile line, and all at a time where they really had no guarantee of exactly how much they were going to make back on the production of oil once they finally got it going. and it's been a successful business for them. And I think Jill's dad at least managed to get a new tractor out of the deal. So here we are on Ogston Farm. There's cattle, there's sheep, and there's crops being grown too, to feed the cattle and also to feed the nation. I mean, the northeast of Scotland is the breadbasket of Scotland. And nowadays, you know, you could travel down these roads around here and around Ellen, and you'll find some agricultural contractor out there at night with his headlamps on, working in a field in his big Italian tractor, and he'll be listening maybe to some country and western music from Nashville, or on his Chinese smartphone in his heated cab, and that's progress. But 100 years ago, the poor soul would be out there behind a plough, pulled by horses, with the rain soaking him to the bone, and he'd be going home to his bothy with maybe a little peat fire to cook his meal on, and not the cosy house with the gas central heating that people are used to today. So let's not disrespect the people who have worked and still work in the oil industry, and what they've brought to our lives. Yes, we're ready to make a transition away from fossil fuels and towards renewables, but as Isaac Newton said, the things that I'm doing, I do because I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. And bringing oil to Cruden Bay was a giant step, and maybe sometime in the future we'll have a little historical marker somewhere remembering the oil industry and Cruden Bay and its place in the oil industry, just as we have museums now to the coal industry, which has vanished and been replaced by the oil industry, just as eventually the oil industry will vanish, replaced, as we've said, with the renewable wind and wave and power and other sources of energy, which will, in many ways, owe their debt to the engineering work that went in to developing North Sea oil.